are listening to Campfire Catholicism. I'm your host, Elton Jarvis, and this is part 2 of the Nature of Evil and Problem of Suffering episode, since we didn't have enough time to get through all that I wanted to talk about just in one episode alone, because I didn't want the episode to be like an hour and 30 seconds long, or however long that would have been. And so I decided to make another episode. That way I wouldn't feel like I am being rushed, and that I can actually get through the points that I want to get through. So I do believe that in part 1, I briefly mentioned a little bit about the nature of evil, but more specifically, I guess, how evil came to exist in the realm of Middle-earth, and also how God can allow evil to exist to bring about greater goods, which I believe I'm going to go more in detail in this episode. Right, I also talked about how evil needs good in order to exist. Like, evil and good are not created to be equal. It's not dualistic. And so evil will always corrupt good, and evil needs good in order to exist. But as soon as evil kills good, it always ends up killing itself. So that is one of evil's weaknesses. And so that is what we talked about last episode. I'm going to continue discussing about the nature of evil, and then we're going to get into a little bit of the problem of suffering. So here we go. The primary object of evil in the Lord of the Rings is that being the object of the One Ring. Okay? The One Ring is so powerful that no living creature can resist the temptation of the One Ring. And there's a reason why Tolkien wanted that to happen, is because no living creature can resist the temptation of the One Ring, so too that every single human being in reality cannot resist temptation, cannot resist the temptation of sin without the use of grace. And so we see this in the Lord of the Rings, where Frodo fails at destroying the One Ring. He actually gives into the temptation and the power of the One Ring, which there's not a lot of stories that actually use this sort of tool. I mean, we look at there are a lot of movies which we look at where the good guys, they always win in the end, and they do in the Lord of the Rings, but it seems to me that there are a lot of heroes that win out of their own merit, where there are very few movies where the good guys actually fail, Lord of the Rings being one of them. The good guys actually do fail. It is not because of Frodo's works or the works of the Fellowship in which the One Ring is destroyed. You know, there's another movie that is quite similar like this, and that is the Avengers Infinity War. The Avengers actually fail in defeating Thanos, and that is why Infinity War was such a good movie in my eyes. That's why it was so good. There was a certain shock aspect to it, which is what evil can do. It can shock us, and it can terrify us. And by shocking and terrifying us, it in a way tricks us into perceiving just how powerful evil truly is. Okay, so there are 2 things that the ring does to its bearer, which we're going to highlight here. First of all, it enhances the already natural powers of the ring bearer. And the second power is that it gives the ring bearer, invisibility. The ring giving invisibility involves the aspect of deception and cunning, which are attributed to evil. Specifically, I am talking about Sauron and coincidentally also Satan. Okay, so I mentioned in a previous episode how Sauron is a shape changer and how he deceived the free peoples of Middle-earth with the form of Anatar, in which he shape changed, looking like a fair elven man. In a way, shape changing involves a sort of invisibility, and it's the invisibility of evil's true face. And so, if Sauron has invisibility in shape-shifting and how he was able to deceive the free peoples of Middle-earth, then the ring which he has also constructed, it would also give invisibility to whoever wields it. Peter Kreeft also points this out in his book, that invisibility would also lead to isolation. And in the face of evil, isolation is suicide. There is no way anybody can ever bear evil alone. There was one man that did do that, and that was Jesus Christ, but only because he is in a community, and that community is the community of the Holy Trinity, in which we believe that God is Father, he is Son, and he is Holy Spirit. It is one of the greatest mysteries of the Christian faith. So that is the first power. The first power involves invisibility. The second power that the ring gives is it enhances the wielder's natural powers. Why is this dangerous? In an early episode, I briefly mentioned how Satan and the demons were the first Pelagianists. They rejected God's gift of grace and desired to be good out of their own works, and it killed them to know that they were only good because God has made them good and because of his gift of grace. So, if the ring enhances your own natural power, it increases the emphasis on yourself, which also even leads to a form of isolation as well, because you are no longer in need of help from a community or others. Instead, you perceive to rely only on yourself and your own works. So, again, that leads to a sort of isolation. So that is focusing on the nature of evil in regards to the object of the One Ring and what it can do to us and when we choose to indulge in evil. Evil, while it is strong, it's also weak. We know that evil inevitably destroys itself, and how evil can be allowed to exist to bring about greater goods, such as the example of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. Evil is weak because it cannot conquer weakness. And Tolkien puts this in The Lord of the Rings. It's not Gandalf, Aragorn, or an elf that brings the ring to the fires of Mordor. Not anybody that is explicitly powerful. It is a hobbit. A humble hobbit. And even he fails at the end, but I just want to focus on the hobbit. There's a thought on how on showing that God doesn't call the equipped, but he equips the called. It would seem to me that out of everybody in the Council of Elrond, Frodo is the least qualified amongst everybody in the Council of Elrond. Yes, he did bring the ring from the Shire to Rivendell, and that was a feat in and of itself, but he was still the least qualified out of everybody that was there. But he was the one that was called. He was the one that was chosen. Well, he was the one that decided to accept that call. And I'm going to actually say that right here. You know, Frodo ended up saying yes to his call to bring the ring to the fires of Mordor. Just how that is also synonymous to even Mary's, the Virgin Mary's, yes, her fiat in the Annunciation. It seems to me that God loves to work through men and women who are weak. It's so that therefore they can rely on God's strength rather than their own, and in being weak. And Peter Kreeft writes this, that in being weak, it involves the free, loving renunciation of power. That is what makes a few of the characters in the Fellowship so memorable. Gandalf renunciates the ring at the Shire when Frodo, in a sense, begs him to take the ring, and Gandalf, he has that line where he's like, "Don't tempt me, Frodo." Aragorn renunciates his call to the throne out of concerns of his weakness, although he was also straying on the side of his own scrupulosity as well. I want to go back to even Gandalf's renunciation of the ring at the Shire. He explicitly mentions, I don't know if it is the same, if it is written the same in the book, but in the movie, he explicitly says this, that he says to Frodo, "Trust me, like, if I took the ring, I would want to desire and use the ring for good. but through me it would wield a power too evil to be imagined, in a sense. And Gandalf understands this. We see also in The Lord of the Rings characters that have failed to renunciate their power, such as Saruman, and also Denethor of Gondor. He also renunciates his call to the throne when Aragorn makes his appearance. A very popular rendition of the free renunciation of power is the Passion of Jesus Christ. He freely renunciates his power and his life for the remission of sins. This should seem... There's a paradox here. But it takes more strength to renunciate your control of power than to seize and to take power out of your own will, which actually in a sense makes you weaker. Renunciating power is actually the stronger of the two choices. And the ring kind of has similar properties to this. When an individual uses the ring, they get more weaker. It drains them, but it also still keeps them alive. Similar to how when we indulge in sin, it progressively gets us weaker, and it can even kill our souls, even though in the moment it feels great. And so to conclude this episode, we are going to discuss about the problem of suffering. The people of Middle-earth are no stranger to the problem of suffering. Rohan has been berated by Saruman, and Gondor, more specifically Osgiliath, is constantly getting sieged by the forces of Mordor. What makes all of these situations so gripping is because they are very real situations, and we can find ourselves in these all the time. Specifically, in regards to these wartime stories that we find in The Lord of the Rings, you can tell that it was inspired by Tolkien's little adventure. I don't want to really say I call it an adventure, but his time in World War II and in what he got to witness and what he got to see, and the horrors that beheld upon him. So why suffering? Why does it happen? In fact, the problem of suffering is one of the greatest objections to faith in general. And in ways, like at first manifests itself in organized religion, but eventually it can encounter the individual, well, it's like, why do I believe in God when there is so much suffering? And this is how that thought process works. Okay, so if suffering exists, then God can't be good, because how can a God be good allowing that allows suffering to happen when suffering is not good? So therefore God cannot be all good. However, if you say that God allows suffering to exist, or if he can't do anything about suffering, then you reject the fact that God is all powerful. Therefore, the Christian God also does not exist. But obviously, in our Christian point of view, God allows suffering to exist in his all knowledge in order to bring about greater goods, which I guess you could say you perceive that would only make God that much more good. But I mean, God is infinitely good, so he can't really be measured in his goodness, but that's just how we perceive him to be. Okay, so another reason why suffering happens is that we're not called for comfort. We are called for greatness. A muscle gets stronger by tearing it through, again, working out. If that is the same for a muscle, can't it also be the same for us? We see how suffering brings virtue out of the members of the Fellowship of the Ring and the free people of Middle-earth. All of this suffering that happens in Middle-earth, we get to see very beautiful moments. For example, there's a lot of suffering involved in the Battle of Helm's Deep. There are many individuals in that battle that are killed, and even the women and the children that are in Helm's Deep. You can imagine that there is a great amount of emotional suffering. One, not knowing if their husbands were going to come back from the war, and also if they were even going to survive the War of Helm's Deep. I mean, they're essentially stuck in the refuge that they have built themselves on. And the movies do this so well, but there's this wonderful scene where they meet suffering head on, and they meet the adversity head on, and they charge out of the keep into all of the orcs, and they're trampling them underfoot like with their horses. And then you see Gandalf appear, and obviously the rest of the Rohirrim appear, and then there's this huge scene where they charge down the line and they absolutely massacre the orcs, which is incredible. We also see the culmination of suffering brings the free people of Middle-earth to storm the Black Gate as a diversion, but it's like, enough's enough. Let's make our stand here. The culmination of suffering also brings 2 hobbits out of the Shire to destroy the One Ring. Well, more specifically, 4 hobbits. But there's a scene in the first movie where Frodo he sees a premonition, or what could happen if the ring isn't destroyed, how the hobbits of the Shire are going to suffer under the tyranny of Sauron. And so that only pushes him more into destroying the ring. And there are moments where, and I guess temptation can be involved in this as well. We also see people that have failed in resisting temptation and also resisting the aspect of suffering. For example, Boromir. And this is why Boromir is such a beautiful example. He's such a human character. He wants to do what is right for the people of Gondor. And that's why he in himself, he wants the ring. He wants to do it out of the desire for good. But obviously, temptation is very cunning and very deceptively smart. And we see that affect Boromir and how he tries to take the ring from Frodo. So there's a great amount of emotional suffering that he's undergoing through his time in the Fellowship. But we see that eventually it pushes him to act out of virtue when he saves Merry and Pippin from the orcs and ends up dying honorably in battle. I don't remember who said this once, but this is such a beautiful quote, and I'm just going to leave it here. There is no shame in a soldier falling in battle, so long as he gets back up. I don't remember where I heard it from, but it was a quote that really stuck out to me one time. So suffering is very prevalent in The Lord of the Rings, and it's also very prevalent in our lives. But suffering is allowed in order to bring about greater goods. Either the greater good could be, for example, the suffering ends and something greater comes in its place, or if, say, for example, the suffering even continues to persist, the individual can grow in virtue. And that in and of itself is also a greater good. So there's a lot more to unpack in the problem of suffering. I might even have a future episode just discussing further about that. But that concludes this 2-part episode of the nature of evil and the problem of suffering. I really hope that all of you guys that are listening, that have listened to this episode, find something that you can take from this. Again, I just want to give a brief summary as to what I talked about. The primary object of evil in The Lord of the Rings is the aspect of the One Ring and how it gives the user both invisibility and enhancing the wielder's natural powers. So invisibility involving isolation and deception, enhancing the individual's natural abilities that can increase pride and narcissism and the individual's own works instead of grace. We talked about how evil cannot use weakness and how it cannot conquer weakness. Obviously, we have the hobbits being one of the quote-unquote weakest members of Middle-earth. They are the ones that are called to destroy the One Ring. and also how in real life, how Jesus Christ renunciated his power and decided to sacrifice himself for the remission of sins. And then we briefly went over the problem of suffering and why does it happen? Why is it allowed to happen? And it's allowed to happen for the greater good, whether that's the greater good of the actual situation or the greater good in the human soul. Okay, so really hope again that you found something out of this episode. I'm struggling to find my words. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. Again, please follow the Facebook page, follow Spotify. I now have a YouTube page, so feel free to follow the YouTube URL as well. And I'm also on Instagram. So I'm on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and, well, obviously Spotify and Apple Music. So you can find me on any one of those platforms. You have been listening to Campfire Catholicism, and I hope all of you guys that are listening have a continued good rest of your day or rest of your evening. Anyways, whatever time period that you're listening into this. Take care, and yes, sweet